Whatever it is we're searching for, whether it's in people or in our lives, there is good to be found. God is everywhere if you are willing to look for him. But if you're looking for the negative, if you're looking for what's not going right, you will find that too. Welcome to the Life on God's Term podcast. We are so thrilled to have you join us. This is the place where we share all the highs and the lows of creating a life, business, and career on God's terms. This is the place for you if you are a stay-at-home mother who's looking for some inspiration, or a career-driven professional or entrepreneur who desires more in their life, but you want to do it God's way. Well, this place is for you. And I am so thrilled to have joined with me again my sister co-hosts, Wendy Hayes and Leslie Danielle. Hello, sisters.
Hello.
Hey, good to see you. I am really excited about our theme today. Leslie, should we introduce it?
Absolutely. So it is life lessons from movies.
Please.
I love movies. Our family grew up with movies. I love the vintage, and obviously you guys love the more modern.
Yeah, I think we grew up obviously watching a lot of movies. We lived in a very rural area, so we didn't get to go to the cinemas a lot. But whenever we got to watch movies at home, we used to go to our grandparents' library and borrow lots of movies. We watched them all the time. And I think when we're talking about faith and God stuff, God speaks through every medium. And obviously, I work in the media sector, and it amazes me how he speaks through movies to me a lot. He speaks through a lot of different content, hopefully this podcast. But obviously, I think there's been a lot of movies we've watched, recently, but obviously some that are classics for us that we go, you know what? There's some real spiritual lessons in that. So today we wanted to share with you, and it's going to show our age, but we're going to share with you some of our vintage classics that we love and some of the lessons that we glean from God's word just from watching these movies. So where should we start? I think we'll start with number one,
which is Field of Dreams.
Ooh,
such a good movie.
It's a good one.
We love it. For those who haven't heard of it, it was filmed in 1989. So Kevin Costner was the star, and it was mostly about his love for baseball and his relationship with his dad.
And I think because obviously we're not technically Australian, although we live in beautiful Australia. We grew up in the South. We grew up in America. Baseball is a huge part of the culture there. And so there are a lot of baseball films. But this is one of those films that really kind of defined a culture at the time. It became this iconic film. I don't think it was hugely popular when it first came out, but I'm not sure. But it just was one of those things that we just kept watching and love to watch again and again. And even now, like as a grown-up, every time I watch it, I get a little bit choked up.
I loved it. I thought it was a bit more popular because I even remember McDonald's, like if you bought like a meal deal, you got a VCR tape like for an extra $5, and they popped the Field of Dreams, which I was pretty psyched about it.
Should we explain to listeners what a VCR tape is? If there's anyone under the age of 25 listening, it's one of those big block things that you put inside of something called a VCR and play it that way. There's nothing digital about it. It had film in it. It was, wow, those were the old days, weren't they?
And you had to rewind it.
Be kind, rewind, I think was what Blockbuster's motto was.
How annoyed we would get. You haven't this has not been rewinded.
Now we have to wait to watch it again.
That's so good. Well, okay. So Field of Dreams, great movie. And it's really about a guy who has this inkling one day. He hears this idea. He has this thought in his head, and he thinks he's going crazy.
Because he's a farmer in Iowa in a cornfield.
Yeah. And he hears this voice, and he thinks that he needs to create a baseball field. And he gets rid of all of his crops. That's their entire livelihood.
And the voice said, if you build it,
he will come. That is the classic kind of quote from the film. And he goes and he speaks to his wife, and she's like, yeah, let's do it. Go for it. And what you see is the journey of what happens when you kind of invest in a dream and you have this inkling and what that looks like. So I think what I would just say is it starts off with, he shares a bit about his journey. It's about building a baseball field. But what comes from that to me is something really touching, because what you actually start to learn is that he had a really complicated relationship with his father. And when he died, it was a very unresolved relationship. And at the very end of the film, not that I want to spoil it, but it actually has nothing to do with baseball, and it has nothing to do with the baseball field itself. It actually has to do with him somewhat making amends and in this beautiful spiritual way. And I love it because there's a beautiful scene at the end where he thinks that he's invested everything. he gets nothing from it. Some really cool things have happened, but he's just had to kind of surrender and go, okay, this is it. This is, I've done it and this is where we're at. And then this beautiful thing happens where his, the spirit of his father shows up. And I love it because it gives him everything that he has secretly desired. And there is a healing, I think, that happens in that moment. And it doesn't matter whether it's money or baseball. It's like God knows the inner secrets of our hearts. And it just reminds me in Psalms 37:4, it says, delight yourself in the Lord and he will give you the desires of your heart. And sometimes delighting yourself isn't, just having joy. It's following his ways and following those prompts that we have. And I love that promise because he will always give us the real desires of our heart, even if we're not sure about what those are at the time. So that's my big takeaway from that film.
I love how you said following the prompts, because in the movie, there was all these signs to follow that only he could see. And people just thought he was crazy. But he even there was a book that they were talking about that the whole town wanted to burn. And and the author name was Terrence Mann. And so for whatever reason, he said, I had a dream and Terrence Mann was in my dream and I need to go and find him. And that was it. He just had he had a dream. So he went and found him and he said, I need to take you to a baseball game because in my dream we were at a baseball game and I should get my next sign. And so
it sounds so crazy.
Well, it was so funny because in the movie, Terrence Mann, he tries to beat him with a baseball bat because he's like, you're a crazy man. Get out of my apartment. But he gave in and they did. And sure enough, he got the next sign. And then, that led him to the other sign. But through all of this, the bank was calling. They had to file for bankruptcy because of the field that he, destroyed his crops for to make the baseball field. It completely ate into their savings. They took out another mortgage on the house. So as he was still searching for these signs and prompts, everything was just falling around him, falling down and just burning up. And God really does that. Whenever there is chaos in your life, you can stand in the eye of the storm and be calm. And you can see things so clearly because he'll give you that peace. And that's what I really took from the movie, as well as the beautiful relationship at the end with the dad. But I just loved how he saw things only he could see and he followed it. Even to the point where, he almost had nothing. He was going to lose everything in the world.
I think there's something about taking that next step. It's not, and trusting, I just know I'm meant to do this one next thing, which can be really terrifying when it absolutely doesn't make sense.
And whether he realized it or not, although he did at the end, Terrence Mann gained his faith and journeyed through it as well. So it was such a beautiful way of God showcases to us that when you step out in faith, you have no idea the faith that you're causing, that ripple effect. I'm working everything to good here, whether you see it or not.
I think that part always struck with me because I relate to this one scene at the very end where actually you see that author who's come out of, he wanted a private life. I want nothing to do with this anymore. I'm done. And actually he's rejuvenated by it and he sees his next chapter.
Yes.
And then there's Ray, who's made all the sacrifices.
Yes.
And he's like, I'm going bankrupt and you're the one who gets to go and do this? And he's angry. And I'm like, I can relate to that. The very human element of going, I've given, I've sacrificed, I've done all this. Why is there something for him? And
I brought them on this.
I brought them on this.
He even said, he said, well, what are you saying, Ray? And he goes, I'm saying, what's in it for me? What do you say? I'm saying, what's in it for me? And every human on the planet can relate to that.
What's in it for me?
What's in it for me? And then that's when the spirit of his dad shows up. All of that was that circle moment for him, but it was also that circle moment for the author, Terrence Mann. And then as the camera steps out, it was the circle moment for their family because financial provision was coming. They just couldn't see it yet.
That's right.
It's so powerful.
That's so right.
When you step out, it's not just about you. It's never just about you. It can't be. And I think that's a really powerful legacy. Let's go to number 2. Wendy, do share.
Oh, okay. This is one of my favorite movies. It's Pollyanna. It's the old Disney one with Haley Mills. And it's, I think it was from I think it was 1960 is when it came out. If you haven't seen it, please watch it. It is one of the sweetest, best movies. And I forget that Disney in its very early stages really
wholesome.
Not only was it wholesome, faith was such a big part. They prayed at the dinners. They went to church together. It was just so sweet in those ways. But one of the life lessons I loved, and just to give you a little bit of background, this little girl was the daughter of missionaries. She was about 8 or 9, and her parents passed away, and she was carted off to live with her very wealthy and cold aunt in the small town, which the aunt, because of her wealth and status, threw her weight around and had a lot of influence. And it was 2 things. One, you got to see the aunt slowly become a little bit more motherly towards her. She didn't know how, and that was learning, but Pollyanna was a beautiful Christian, and she wove her kindness through the town. She even played this little game called the Glad Game. She would find, no matter how difficult her situation was, and go, well, she's living with a wealthy aunt. Her aunt put her in the very top of the attic with nothing. She had a very lovely home, but she didn't give Pollyanna nice things until much later. But Pollyanna was glad just to be there. Pollyanna was in that beautiful Christian, kept showing up. And the pastor of that town even would check in with the aunt with the sermon, because she did so much, gave so much money, I guess you would say.
She was the financial resource for the town.
Thank you. And Pollyanna was visiting the pastor in the field, because he would go and prepare his sermons there. And Pollyanna was listening, and she just said this one thing, and it was really beautiful. And she said, "But Pastor, no one owns a church." And he just sat there, and it was so beautiful. And he got emotional over it. And I get emotional because there's so much happening in churches and things, and you almost feel that. But yeah, and I'll go on and just say this very last thing too. He said, "Do you know, the pastor went and he really searched the Bible, and he said, there are 800 texts about happiness." He said there's 820 texts in the Bible about being glad. He said, maybe we should listen to that and not all the other.
Mm.
And I just thought it's such a moment for us now, that because there's so much in the world. Yeah.
I love that. I think the main thing that's one of the pinnacle moments of that film, where he just recognizes he's been pleasing man in that situation. It was the woman who held the money. She could have cut it off, and then he's done. He'd probably have to leave the church. They'd probably have to move. But he was pleasing her and not God. And it is so easy to do that. And I know I'm a former people pleaser, I would say. I think a lot of women are, but men too. People just, we all want to please our people. We want to please our bosses. We want to please our clients. We want to please our family. And I think there's something about, sometimes God just kind of gets left off, like, oh, I'm sure it's fine. But, I think it's a really slippery slope sometimes. But just to check in with, are we really aiming as our number one goal to please God, or are we just going to please people first and hope it all kind of works out in the wash? And it's from the mouths of babes, they will just tell you everything. My little son he will tell me if I am not being kind, or he will tell me, he goes, "Mommy, you shouldn't do that." And I'm like, okay. But they know. We are intrinsically, I think, born to know that right or wrong. And but yeah, I think that's such a powerful lesson from that movie. That's really good.
And I love the innocence of a child, because they see things with such purity, and they don't use, big language. It's just as simple as, well, nobody owns a church.
Yeah.
And that's all that you need.
But then we're also meant to have childlike faith too.
Exactly.
Go on.
Which is so hard when you've got bills to pay, and you've got a board who goes, we need to do this and that. And we can see the church has been hurting for a long time. There's been a lot of people deserting the church because there's been pain caused. And there's really
people abusing the church as well.
A lot of it. Yeah. There's a lot of things. And so it's really hard to kind of pull back from that and go, where do we sit with that?
Where is God in this? Is he the center? Even with Jesus, there wasn't a church, there wasn't a building. It was, just a man in the desert walking around in sandals, and, people congregated and heard truth. And, so I don't know, I think we need to go back to the basics.
Just the stripping back. One of the things that happened to us during COVID was we ended up doing a home study with our Barbara, our mother, who's our spiritual director and mentor. And it was really beautiful. It reminded us of the really old days back in the South of where we grew up. We would just sit on the living room floor, open up a Bible, and just meditate on the Word. And that was it. And I think church is an important thing. It's beautiful.
Absolutely.
And I think it's never perfect. And but it is the bride of Christ.
Yeah.
And it's something that I think we have to invest in a way, but also just make sure we're always looking to please God and not anyone or anything else first. But yeah, there's definitely a stripping back at the moment, I would say. Okay, beautiful. And last but not least, we really struggled over this one. Number 3 is the classic of Star Wars. There's such a pause here. Like, where do we go? Where do we start? Everyone knows Star Wars, but what is okay? I mean, it's good versus evil. It is the pinnacle of. I remember sitting in a religion class, and Star Wars was the first lesson because they were like, "This is actually one of the biggest religious films ever," because it just shows, and a lot of the big films that came after that, it really that polarizing good versus evil, the hero's journey, Yoda, what the Holy Spirit is. There's so much there. Go ahead.
And the Force, you got to talk about the Force being the Holy Spirit.
All right. You go, Wendy, because this was perhaps more from your time.
It wasn't my time, but you guys loved it.
It's the Star Wars Tower. Do you remember this? You had the whole galaxy thing.
Yeah,
one Christmas.
I loved Star Wars in terms of, I guess, the spiritual aspect. The Force, and I think we lived in such a time that they weren't so sure with our church. Oh, should kids be watching Star Wars? But the more you really looked at it, and we're comparing that the Force is like the Holy Spirit. Yoda is a reflection of this. It actually heightens your sense of giving kids first a really fun thing to look at. It was a beautiful story, but it does show so many.
You know what? Can I go all the way to the end? Can I say one of the things I love the most? The redemption. There's real redemption.
I love it.
It's beautiful. It was right at the end, but you always have a choice, no matter where you're at or how far you've gone. Like for his father at the very end, he just makes that choice. And it was like Darth Vader. I'm like, but actually, he still had that inside of him, that ability. And I thought because we went and saw the prequels and stuff, you go, he was trained in that, but it is still inside of you. And for me, perhaps because I'm a mother now, I can look back and go, this is so important to have it inside of my child. Because at one point, no matter how far down he goes a road, I know it's inside of him. And we always have a choice. That's the free will. But in the end, there was redemption there. And even though it was a choice right at the end, it didn't matter everything else he'd done. He made this choice. And then at the end, you kind of see, Darth Vader at the end redeemed, if you will. So anyway, that's my,
It's kind of like that Indian proverb of which wolf, we all have two wolves, and which one do you feed? And it's that same.
So good. Well, this has been fun. This has been a trip down memory lane, really.
Definitely.
I mean, I'm hoping we'll have more new films to talk about next time. I do like going back to some of the vintage classics, but it's really just an encouragement that God speaks through all mediums, as we said. And I just really wanted to encourage our listeners today that find the good. Like in Pollyanna, it was like, there's good if you want to find it. Whatever it is we're searching for, whether it's in people or in our lives, there is good to be found. God is everywhere if you are willing to look for him. If you are seeking for him, you will find him. But if you're looking for the negative, if you're looking for what's not going right, you will find that too. So I just want to encourage you to look for the good today. I think that's my takeaway. Do you have any other takeaways?
God will always give you a sign.
Wendy?
That quote by Abraham Lincoln, when you look for the bad in mankind, you will certainly find it. But when you look for the good, you will also find it.
I love that. That is a beautiful way to close this episode off. Thank you so much for joining the Life on God's Term podcast. We hope you join us again. Do look at us on social media. We are at Life on Her Terms Media, and we will see you next time.